Hi, you're watching NewsX. I'm Megha Sharma, and we are talking about the very important G20 Leaders Summit that is taking place in Johannesburg next week. The theme and priorities of G20 Johannesburg that have been set by South Africa under its presidency are solidarity, equality, and sustainability. Amidst all the challenges that South Africa is tackling this year for its G20 presidency, are of course being overshadowed by US President Donald Trump boycotting the G20 summit. Let's talk about all this and more. Joining me on the show right now is the South African High Commissioner to India, His Excellency Anil Sooklal. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for joining me and talking to me about this. First of all, I would like to understand from you about the priorities that have been set, the theme. What is the importance of solidarity, equality, and sustainability that have been picked as the theme for G20 summit this year by South Africa?
Well, the theme was carefully considered, taking into account the journey G20 has traveled since the first summit in 2008, and especially over the last three summits, beginning with Indonesia in 2022, as Global South countries. And also in terms of what's happening in terms of the geopolitical, economic, and financial architecture at the present time. So, of course, solidarity speaks to the need of the hour. The world is fracturing even more. We are seeing challenges within countries and between countries. Conflict is on the rise. And the issue of inequality. What we have seen, especially with COVID and post-COVID, is that COVID produced more millionaires and drove more of the global population into poverty and inequality. And that trajectory continues. Therefore, we felt it was important to address the issue of inequality. And as part of our presidency, our president appointed a panel of experts to look at global inequality, headed by Joseph Stiglitz. Now, that work was completed, and a copy of the report was shared with President Ramaphosa to be tabled at the Leaders Summit. The report is very revealing. Just to cite some of what the issues that came to the fore in that report, it was noted that 83% nationally of countries have high levels of inequality. And this represents 90% of the global community. When you speak of high levels of inequality, they use the measure of the World Bank, which defines inequality as countries having a Gini coefficient of 0.4 and above. Now, what they also found is that 43% of new wealth generated in the world post-COVID has been harnessed by 1% of the population. And the bottom half of the global population only benefited from 1% of new wealth. Secondly, one of the themes we also have is food insecurity. And this report also looks into the issue of food insecurity. And they found that 1 in 4 persons globally have moderate to severe food insecurity. And that means skipping 1 or more meals a day. So you can see the issue of insecurity and food insecurity and inequality is on the rise. And of course, the third part of the theme is on sustainability. Now, at the recently held United Nations General Assembly in September of this year, United Nations Secretary General was speaking about the SDGs. As you know, it was adopted in 2015, and our target is to achieve the 17 SDGs by 2030. We are less than 5 years away from 2030. And he pointed out that collectively, the world has only achieved about 18% of the SDGs. So obviously we're going to fall far short, and especially amongst the poorer and developing countries, because we're not getting the kinds of support that one expected in terms of us achieving the SDGs. So sustainability, of course, is a major focus, including the impact of a sustainable environment. As you know, we are seeing increasingly issues of climate change and climate inaction rather than action impacting very negatively on the poorer countries. A further point of focus during our presidency has been on the issue of using AI and innovation for sustainability. Now, AI is a relatively new development, but it impacts all of us equally. And those countries that have advanced technologies are harnessing AI for the benefit of their countries. But we believe that the benefits of AI, as well as the challenges it imposes on countries, and there are many challenges, must be equally distributed. Now, of course, poorer countries don't have advanced technology or access to technology, and we don't want to see a monopoly again of using AI in terms of sustainable development and advancing our respective developmental agenda. So AI, innovation, data governance are important focus areas for us. And another important focus area is on critical minerals. As you know, critical minerals today is a very important aspect of the global economy. And also in terms of new technologies, it is critical that you have access to critical minerals. But these deposits of critical minerals are spread out unevenly. But more importantly, those that have the technology to mine and to use critical minerals for new technologies are again the more developed economies. And again, we are saying Africa, for example, is a reservoir of a number of critical minerals. And we don't want to see a repeat of extractive economies where countries come and extract the minerals from the continent and the continent doesn't benefit from this. We want to see a mutually reinforcing relationship in terms of harnessing critical minerals for development. And finally, of course, another very important focus, which has been on the G20 agenda for a few years, but continues to be a major issue, especially for Africa and the developing world, is that of debt sustainability. As you know, increasingly, poorer countries are finding it very difficult in order to meet the debt commitments. And the major part of the GDP of the poorer countries, especially in Africa, is used to service debt rather than for development. And the manner in which debt has been structured, traditional debt, is to the disadvantage of our countries. So how can G20 play a role in trying to look at how we build on the decisions taken in 2020 under Saudi Arabia's G20 presidency when we adopted the G20 framework for debt? So these are the critical issues that, of course, another overriding issue that has been part of the G20 agenda and is, I think, at the present time, very critical, is reinforcing the global multilateral architecture. What we are seeing is an undermining of multilateralism and the move towards unilateralism, not just in terms of addressing global security issues, in terms of our commitments around climate change and the Paris Agreement, but more recently weaponizing trade through the use of tariffs, unilateral use of tariffs in terms of punishing countries. And that impacts on the development of countries, but more importantly, in many countries, South Africa included, that has been hit with very high tariffs. We are seeing job losses, we are seeing companies struggling to stay afloat, and the devastating impact this has had on livelihoods of the poor.
Yeah. Talking about United States boycotting G20 Johannesburg summit, leaders summit, and we see that this news has overshadowed and been headlines for the last few weeks and months ever since the US President Donald Trump made that announcement. How important is America in taking forward and building upon these goals and ambitions of G20?
Well, look, the reality is the USA is the largest global economy, the most powerful country in many senses today. And whatever they do impacts on the global community. You are seeing this in terms of the tariffs at the moment.
Yeah.
They're emanating from one country, but they're running riot to the global economy. They're running riot with our local economies, our regions, not just on the economic front, because the unilateral use of tariffs goes far beyond economics. It goes and penetrates into livelihoods, into the stability of countries. So it's unfortunate, as President Ramaphosa himself has stated, boycotts do not serve any purpose. And it's unfortunate that the USA has decided not to be present at the high table at the G20 summit in Johannesburg this coming week. Because we must recognize that the USA has played a very positive role within the G20 and has been one of the chief architects in bringing us together at the level of summit. When we had the financial crisis of 2008, and we must recall that that crisis was in the global north. It emanated in Europe and the USA. And the impact of that, living in a globalized world, was on all of us. In terms of the mismanagement of the banks and the financial systems of these countries, we all suffered because of their actions, because we live in an interconnected, interdependent world. So the action of one country impacts on all of us. So the act of the USA not coming to the G20 naturally is going to impact on the G20. It's a unique position that the G20 finds itself in, because we must also recall that in 2008, the first summit in Washington in November was convened by the USA under its presidency. And within the first 2 years, we had 5 summits, 2 of them in the USA. So the USA was at the forefront in working with the rest of the global community as a collective. They saw the value and benefit that they couldn't single-handedly address the challenges and the fault lines, that they need to do it with the largest economies of the world, both North and South, and has been a positive force in working for the success of the G20 these past 19 summits. So it's unfortunate now that they will be absent from the table. But at the same time, this journey of the G20 has consolidated the G20 as a very critical and important platform where the major countries of the world can collectively address our common challenges. And through an inclusive process, through consensus, find solutions to these issues. Be they security issues, be they financial challenges, economic challenges, challenges pertaining to sustainability, climate change, climate risk and disaster, and including the pandemic, that we have to act as a collective to find solutions. So the G20 is a collective. It is about 19 countries and 2 major regional organizations that act in tandem for the betterment of humanity. It is not dependent on one country. The absence of one country impacts on the body politic of the G20, but it doesn't paralyze the G20. So we are confident that we will still have a successful G20 summit, because I believe all member states, not just member states, because as you know, the G20 goes beyond just member states. All of the major multilateral institutions are part of the G20. They partake in all of the meetings during the course of the year. And the heads of all of these organizations, from the World Bank, IMF, the United Nations, you name it, they are all present around the table. So you have a powerful collective besides the 19 countries around the table. You also have invited guest countries that are part of the G20. And this year, as you also know, there's a major focus on the African continent, given that it's the first time that an African country is presiding over the G20 and it's being hosted on the African continent. So in many senses, I think the USA, it's not about boycotting the summit because it's held in South Africa. It's what we see as a boycott of the African continent, because it's the first time that Africa has had the privilege of showing leadership and having the world come to the African continent in a summit for the benefit of all of us. So I think the loss is the USA's, the loss is not the G20's loss. I believe the collective will prevail, and the G20, as I said previously, is too big to fail.
The BRICS summit is taking place in India next year, 2026. There have been members of BRICS who have been proponents of de-dollarization, reducing their dependency on the American dollar. Do you think this is a viable option, and is there a consensus within the BRICS nations to move forward on this ambitious plan?
Well, let me firstly correct the issue of de-dollarization and BRICS. De-dollarization has never been on the agenda of BRICS under any one of our presidencies, including the current under Brazil, also under South Africa, where this issue came up sharply into the public domain that BRICS is working towards de-dollarization. Now, BRICS has been for a long time speaking about trading in local currencies and reinforcing trade between ourselves using financial platforms that we ourselves design and not being totally dependent. I think one of the issues that BRICS is about is to assert the independence of countries of the global south in terms of choices they have, including trading choices, financial choices, monetary systems, payment platforms. These are the choices of countries that respect their sovereignty, but also would like to have greater say in designing a more inclusive global architecture on the monetary and financial front, and not being dependent totally on a system that's been operated, designed, and run by the global north has been the case. So what BRICS has been emphasizing, and which has wrongly been read as de-dollarization, is the issue of trading in local currencies. And you have seen now nearly all of the BRICS countries are increasingly trading in local currency. We are seeing India has agreements with over 20 plus countries, so has China, so has Russia. Brazil is doing the same. In Africa, under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, one of the issues that leaders agreed on in advancing that agreement is to create a Pan-African payment and settlement system. And we have done that. Over 20 African central banks are part of this mechanism. And it's estimated that if we trade in our local currencies on the continent amongst ourselves and not be dependent on a foreign currency, Africa will save over $5 billion annually, which can be directed to development. So this is what is happening, and I think it's an inevitable move. Secondly, I think it's only natural. The USA's share of global trade has fallen dramatically over the past 3-4 decades. The USA's share of the global economy is not what it was. So why should you have one currency as a dominant currency from a country that no longer makes up over 50% of the global economy? On the contrary, it's far less than 20% at the present time. So countries want to have greater freedom in terms of the currencies they choose, the reserve currencies as well that they have. The basket is getting bigger. But more importantly, also creating payment platforms, because countries of the global south were alarmed when you had unilateral sanctions being placed, financial sanctions on countries like Iran and Russia by countries of the global north, freezing their assets and even threatening to use those assets themselves. Countries have decided that we need to take control of our own financial systems and we need to create our own payment systems. Why must we only be dependent on the SWIFT system? Why can't we create like India has created its own, like China has created its own? so that we have that security as well, that we're in charge of our own financial systems and payment systems, even though it is part of the global whole. So this is what you are seeing as a development as the global south rises. That when you speak of the rise of the global south, it's not just measured in terms of GDP. There are so many measures that must be applied to see the rise of the global south. Your financial systems, your financial independence, your payment systems, new technologies, that we are not totally dependent. As we are seeing that we are suffering, as we are seeing now as the COP30 discussions are taking place in Belém in Italy, the major issue is access to technology, access to green finance. And it's not coming at the level of what has been promised. So more and more countries of the global south is asserting the independence, the creativity, and deepening interaction amongst themselves in finding solutions to the challenges where we have been dependent by and large and recipients of technologies and systems to govern our own national systems. Why can't we design our own? And the New Development Bank is one example of BRICS acting in tandem to show what is possible if we put our resources together to work for our development.
I do want to bring to focus the bilateral relations between India and South Africa. And you're talking about how a South-South collaboration is required to fulfill the ambitions and the welfare and development of the global South. Particularly, how can India and South Africa come together in strengthening their bilateral relations and also being leaders in building global South and safeguarding global South from the pressures and challenges that the world is facing?
Well, bilateral relations are strengthened not just through the coming together of two governments. There are various dimensions that impact on strengthening this interaction between two governments. Of course, the first point of reference is establishing good relations between two countries, which was established at the dawn of our democracy. But we have a history that predates our democracy, a very strong history that goes back centuries. And yesterday, we celebrated a very important day. It was the 165th anniversary of the arrival of the first indentured Indians in South Africa. And of course, the Indian diaspora in South Africa today, people of Indian origin, it's a very vibrant community of over 1.7 million people. They are a link between India and South Africa. The Gandhi factor is well known, that has linked our two countries through history and in terms of shaping our common struggle and the influence we exerted on each other's liberation struggles. So we have this strong basis underpinning this very vibrant relationship. So India also played a very leading role in our freedom struggle. India was the first country to impose sanctions. You were the first country to take our challenges globally when you were the first to raise it at the United Nations. And you were also the first country to impose comprehensive sanctions against South Africa. Yesterday we were very happy to see South Africa won the first test match.
Yeah.
I think it made up for the loss of the women's cricket match. But that's the vibrancy in the relationship. I think when you look at South Africa-India relationship, it goes beyond just governments. Yes, Prime Minister Modi and President Ramaphosa have excellent chemistry. They meet very often. They're good friends, like they will do now when Prime Minister is in Johannesburg. And of course, having that kind of personal interaction between our leaders helps to set the template for the relationship in the right direction. And we have that strength to the relationship underpinned by our leaders and the frequency of contact that we have at a government level, but equally important at the people-to-people level. Sport has played such a major role. South Africa was suspended from the ICC because of its apartheid policies, which extended into sport. But when we were readmitted to the ICC, the first country that we had a test match with was exactly in Eden Gardens in 1992. with India. And that itself is symbolic, that our re-entry into the world of sport was celebrated in a match with India. So, in terms of cultural affinity that we have between ourselves, there's so much of interchange. Tourism is vibrant between our two countries, educational exchanges between our institutions, our students, our academics, our think tanks. It's a multifold, multi-level, deep-seated relationship because we have the same vision. As countries of the global south that suffered the same hardships and exploitation under colonialism, racism, and being relegated to the margins of global society, we have the common vision based on the travails that we went through, that we want to create a more inclusive world. And that is why your theme, One World, One Future, One Family, that you chose for the G20 presidency, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, resonates so well with our theme and what we would like to see as African philosophy speaks of Ubuntu, which means exactly the same as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It's about the totality. It is not about colonizing and exploiting people. Our countries have never had that history.
Yeah.
And I think that's the strength of what brings us together in terms of our common vision for our people, our country, our region, and for the world as a whole. Irrespective whether you're from the north or south, we believe in a common humanity. And I think that's what strengthens and underpins this very vibrant relationship we have between our two countries and its peoples.
Yeah. There was a very unfortunate incident that took place on 10th of November earlier, a terror attack. Of course, countries across the globe have come out and supported India in its fight against terrorism. How can South Africa and India work together to fight the scourge of terrorism?
Well, let me say terrorism is an agenda item that's discussed quite deeply when our leaders meet, when our ministers meet at the bilateral level. But it is also very much part of the agenda when we meet in multilateral fora like the BRICS. Every BRICS declaration has quite a lengthy focus on addressing the scourge of humanity called terrorism. There's no place for terrorism anywhere in the world. Wherever it may occur, it must be eradicated. And we can only do that by working as a collective, because terrorism may occur in Delhi, but it resonates in all parts of the world, the impact of it, because there's no place for this kind of barbaric and extreme behavior in order to achieve whatever you want to achieve. On the contrary, it is actually taking humanity backwards. And we that believe in peace, in harmony, in coexistence, in working together for the mutual benefit of all of humanity, no amount of terrorist attacks or terrorist activities is going to deter us from our goal. On the contrary, we are seeing increasingly intolerance, and there must be total intolerance of any forms of terrorism. And from wherever it may emanate, for whatever reasons, there's no place in the world for terrorism. And South Africa and India, we're on the same page as far as eradication of terrorism is concerned.
Your Excellency, Sooklal, thank you very much for talking to me, for talking to us on NewsX, and those insights that help us build a relationship that forges ahead between India and South Africa, and of course the Global South as an entity to take forward in a world that is multipolar, and the strength of it lies in the relationship between India and South Africa, and of course the G20 presidency as well.
Thank you for having me. Always a privilege.